Hello and welcome into another edition of Huber and Friends. I'm Jeremy Huber, and today we're lucky enough to be joined by another one of the folks that I've gotten to know over the years, who I really like and appreciate, Chris Knoche. Chris, thank you so much for joining me on Huber and Friends. Really looking forward to it.
Thanks, man. It's great to be with you, Jeremy. It's been a while since we had a chance to catch up, and now's as good a time as any, I guess, to do that.
Yeah, before you get hot and heavy into basketball season, so it's good to have you on.
81 days before
man.
the first game.
I'm sure you're counting it down, just loving every minute of it. Chris, this is how I start these off, every single one of them. I ask my guest, how did we meet?
How did you and I meet?
Yep.
Well, I think our one friend we have in common, of course, is BJ Kubarulis, right? And I think BJ made that introduction. You and I had lunch with a group of people out by George Mason one day. I think BJ had put that together. But we also did some games together at the height of COVID, right? You and I were down at the DC Convention Center doing some games and with nobody in the stands.
Yep.
And it was an awful lot of fun. The games were very, very good, if I remember correctly. Mason was a part of that tournament. Howard was in there as well. And I believe that's when we first met, Jeremy. Is that correct? Does that sync with you?
So actually, the first time we met was when you and Glenn Consor did the Capital Classic together, and I did sidelines for you. Now, the first time we had done a game together was at the Paradise Jam, which had been relocated due to COVID. But yeah, so that was the first time. But obviously, I had heard you on the radio for years before that. We'll get into that. But the secondary thing is we do have another connection. Is that I remember I met you, I believe, at an American University kickoff event when I was doing their basketball games. And I took a picture. We said hello. And I put it up on my Facebook. And basically, I guess my mother's cousin, Brian Bohr, who went to high school with you at WT Woodson, immediately was like, hey, that's Knoche. We went to high school together. So then he kind of had to go through that. So again, I guess the family line at some point had come in contact with the Knoche. So that was a cool little thing on my end of things.
I remember Brian well. Brian and I actually went to middle school together, and he was a great athlete. You know, he was a very good athlete back in the day. Now, obviously, there's been some years since that all transpired. But, yeah, he's a good man, and I lost track of him. Please pass on a hello.
Oh, we will. We will. He's got 4 lovely daughters, a lot of sports in that family. Got some grandsons coming up now that are pretty good in baseball. So I'll definitely pass that along. Awesome. Chris, wanted to get into that. Obviously, you are a DMV guy, pretty much born and bred. I think early on you were maybe out on the West Coast a little bit or up north, but most of your formative years in the DC area. What was it like, your time in Fairfax and the DMV?
Yeah, I grew up in a different Fairfax that exists today. You know, I grew up off of, I went to Woodson High School, but my father originally located here, I grew up in Mantua, which is right off of 236. And I remember vividly as a kid, 236 Little River Turnpike was a 2-lane road without a whole lot of lights on it either. And now, of course, it's a main artery off the Beltway and, point of congestion and frustration, I think, for a lot of people during the course of the day. But it was a Mayberry-esque kind of thing, Jeremy. You know, I was fortunate. I grew up in a great neighborhood, went to some great schools, and was fortunate enough to cross paths with a lot of people who made a difference in my life from a really young age. And I didn't know it at the time, but man, with the benefit of hindsight, you know, you sort of look at all the paths that crossed yours, and it's hard to not feel anything but really, really lucky.
When you were at WT Woodson, again, really salad days for that place, and you played for Coach and Red Jenkins, a legend, and I've heard, went back and watched some of the stuff you talked about him, just so much respect you had for him as a coach. Kind of tell me about what it was like playing for him and what you learned from him.
It was a very familial sort of a situation, you know, where, he created such a great culture for the program, and he was fun to play for. You know, guys wanted to run through a wall for him. I I was really lucky, Jeremy. The core group of guys I played with were friends of mine from 4th grade on. And so we played a lot of basketball together. And as a result, we had a pretty good group in terms of cohesion and chemistry. And my senior year, I was all region my last 2 years. My senior year, I was the leading scorer on a team that had 5 guys in double figures. The region was really loaded at the time. Robinson was very good. T.C. Williams, always good. And, schools like Lake Braddock had really just opened. South Lakes wasn't even a glint in the eye at that point in time. So really there weren't that many schools, not nearly as many schools as there are right now. But in terms of Red, Red just really, he loved the game so much that it was one of those things that was impossible for it not to rub off on you. We spent a lot of time together. I stayed, I think that in my high school 4 years, I think there was probably only a handful of days where I did not stay after school and play basketball, work out, and get shots up or play 5-on-5 or 3-on-3 or what have you. And during the course of that time, I spent a lot of time. I don't know that I appreciated it all at the time, but I do now. I spent a lot of time with Red on and off the court. And, really got an idea sort of the way he thought and the vision that he had. And, it's one of those things now where I go to high school games and it looks like, sometimes I hate to pass judgment here too, because I'm not in their practices, but sometimes you go to games and you think, man, that guy is doing it for the stipend. If you're really committed to the cause, it's an all-encompassing sort of a thing at any level, high school, what have you. And Red put his heart and soul into it, and it felt very, very important to us, to me, and it was for sure.
Chris, before we move on to your college career and obviously some life-changing things there, you were a guy that didn't play in the Capital Classic, but you played in the pregame before it, where it was the Maryland versus Virginia All-Stars. And I guess my question would be, what are some memories from that whole process of playing in high school All-Star games where you're around some other really good players, maybe not even the ones that you knew from your team, but other ones on other squads that maybe would go on to do some really big things?
So, yeah, it's interesting. I got a chance to play a lot in 2 All-Star games. One was the prelim to the Cap Classic. That was, at that point in time, it was Virginia versus Maryland. And then there was shortly thereafter, 3 weeks later, there was another game that was played at Cap Center, and it was sort of a reprise of the Maryland Virginia thing. So I got a chance to play there twice. Funny story for you, Jeremy. I played for Don McCool. Don was a legend, of course, at West Springfield and Mount Vernon, and he was a hard charger, very intense guy. He was all about full court pressure, man-to-man defense. And so we had these practices. Now, we had a really good team, Virginia All-Star, so everybody could really play. And he busted our asses for about 2 weeks leading up to this game. And it was all about, defensive slide drills and zigzags. And, it was balls to the wall. And then we played Maryland and we spanked them pretty good. And now let me fast forward. My freshman year, I started at the University of Colorado. I'm playing in a pickup game and this guy walks into the gym and I'm thinking, damn, that guy looks familiar. And it was a starting point guard on the Maryland team. He also ended up at Colorado as well. So I went over to him breaking the games and I introduced myself and said, I don't know if he said, yeah, I remember you, and so we got a chance to talk a little bit. And I said, I brought up the All-Star game. And so I told him, I said, man, for 2 weeks, we were diving on the floor. We were doing zigzags. We were doing everything to prepare for that game. And he started laughing. He said, I swear to God, in our practices, we practiced for about 45 minutes and then played ultimate Frisbee the rest of practice. So, I guess there are multiple ways to skin that cat. And it was a great experience playing for McCool, who I think recently passed. But, and I think also the story about, between Red and McCool, completely different guys, completely different styles, personally and professionally. But there are multiple ways to get it done, and they both, got it done in a big way.
Was that a good experience for you to jump into that maybe before your college career started, to have that coach after having quote unquote the nice guy coach in high school for most of your run, to get that different style?
Well, ultimately, Jeremy, something had to prepare me for the fire-breathing dragon that is Gary Williams. So I guess in retrospect, I don't think I appreciated it at the time, because, it's the spring, it's one of those times where you think you're going to decelerate a little bit, after your basketball season, and McCool would not allow that. But yeah, in retrospect, it was really healthy.
Chris, you mentioned your time at Colorado. That's something that I didn't know. I knew obviously you had been an American playing for Gary Williams, but Colorado, what led you out there to be a Buff, and what led you back to the East Coast?
So I went out there. I always wanted to go to school there. Most of my family, my mother's from Colorado. We would vacation out there every year, going to see her family. And my dad had played there once upon a time, back in the 40s. He was the leading scorer in what was the Big Eight at that point in time. And so I always wanted to play there. I was being recruited a little bit by them, and then their coach got fired at the end of my senior year of high school. So I went out there as a walk-on, and they had come to see me play. Red had reached out to them. They'd come to see me play in the prelim game to the Capital Classic, and then, sat in my living room and said, we just don't think you're good enough to play for us. And so the game was shortly thereafter. I could not have played any better than I played in the Capital Classic in that game. It was in a limited number of minutes, because it's an all-star game. Like I said, I played as well as I could possibly play. So they didn't think I was good enough, and I figured I'd give it a shot. So we went out there, and through luck, good fortune, right place, right time, which is sort of a theme in my life, I not only ended up making the team, but I ended up playing. I was a backup point guard at that time, and played in a lot of great games, in a lot of big games. First guy I ever played against in college was Michael Cooper. Wow. Who was playing, obviously great Laker, Hall of Famer. And he was a star guard at the University of New Mexico. That was the first college game I ever played. And I remember thinking, man, I got to get to class, because this guy is playing, is a different game than the one I'm used to. So playing a lot of good games. Midway through January of that year, we were playing at Missouri, and I got clipped as I went up for as I drove through the lane, and I came down awkwardly and tore all the ligaments in my ankle. And so I was done for the season. That was back when, anytime you had a knee or ankle injury, they were basically doing surgery with rusty scissors. In this day and age, there might have been, a possibility to rehab, but I was done for the year, casted for a couple of months. And I worked hard to get back. My sophomore year, I came in, and again, because I had played a bunch as a freshman, the head coach continually told me, if a scholarship becomes available, it's yours. And there was a scholarship that became available that he gave out to somebody else. And when I went back in September, he sat me down and told me that, and he talked about my rehab, and it basically was it was one of those things where I felt like I was smarter than he was, and in retrospect, it probably was a mistake. But I said I'm not even going to go through this year. I sat out as a sophomore, just played intramural basketball. Had a great time. I was a regular student, which was very healthy. And then after that year, after my sophomore year, I was playing in pickup games. I was back here playing in pickup games at George Mason, and Gary Williams had just gotten the job at AU. He came out to watch. I might have been Red who told him to come out. There were a number of really good players, all college players, playing in these pickup games. And Gary came out. We got to talking a little bit. We had mutual friends in common in the coaching world at that point in time. And so he did his due diligence, but he did ask me, so why don't you come by campus and we'll visit. Now, this was August. This was literally 3 weeks before I was ready to go back to Colorado. And I was ready to go back to Colorado. Boulder, Colorado is a special place to go to school. So 3 weeks before that, before school starts, Gary pulls me into his office and he said, listen, I need to change the culture here. We need to get better humans, better people in this program. I'd like you to come back. I have a full scholarship for you. So, what is the Robert Frost thing? The road not taken, right? You always wonder where you'd be if you chose a different path. And that was absolutely the one biggest life-changing decision in my life. Whether my parents could afford Colorado, that wasn't the issue. I was having a great time there, and that's not an issue. But I wanted to play again. And, having a scholarship was a big part of it. I wanted to get back in the game. So I decided I had to break a lease in Boulder, but I decided to come back at that point in time. And it was the best decision I ever made.
How quick did you have to make that decision? I'm sure Gary at some point was like, look, I need an answer. How quick did you have to make that life-altering decision?
Well, you know what? I'm not really a hand wringer by nature, Jeremy. I'm not, the thing is, you are in that situation. I remember vividly thinking, there's no wrong decision. I'm completely blessed. I'm going to make a decision, move forward, and I'm not going to think twice about it. And so I think we decided on sort of a 24-hour period, but that 24-hour period I used to call the other guys in Boulder that I was supposed to lease this house with and tell them I won't be there, And so I used the time wisely just to get out of that. And then, and then I got to AU, and, it was a different world than Colorado, different kind of coach. And, it was, ended up being a great decision.
You end up spending, I believe, 3 total years there. You played 2. You had to sit out a year because of the transfer, and you played for a Hall of Fame coach in Gary Williams, kind of in the start of his head coaching career. What was it like playing for Gary back then?
I was his first college recruit, and I don't have a whole lot of barks as a player. I not a whole lot of brags, but one of the things I always tell people is I was Gary Williams' first signee. So it's an interesting dichotomy, Jeremy. When I'm sitting out, and that was back in the day when guys actually had to sit out when they transfer. Now that's just a quaint thing of the past, right? Yeah. Now you transfer and you're immediately eligible. So I sat out the 1 year, and when you do that, you're inoculated because you're not in the rotation, you're not playing. You're sort of away from criticism, from the glare of critique, And so I was always the marked guy on the scout team. I would play everybody's leading scorer. And, and so it was like having a starring role in a play that no critics ever saw, And so it was a lot of fun doing that. And, we were just okay that first year, right around 500. And then the next year I became eligible, and we were still just okay. Things really broke the following year, my last year at AU, where we ended up winning 24 games, school record number of games at that point in time. But it was Gary's will that made that happen. I mean, he was so good. And as wild and as nuts as he was at Maryland for all those years, this was a 33, 34-year-old Gary Williams. And he was he would say things across the huddle from you that would terrify you, and, but man, we loved playing for him. He was he wore his heart on his sleeve. The effort and the intensity was so contagious. We played like a bunch of caged animals, which is exactly what he wanted. And the style was great, full court pressure, push it up the floor. And this was well before, this was back in the day, there was no shot clock, no 3-point line. We were playing 94 feet every single practice, every single game. It was great fun.
Yeah, and again, like you said, it was the kind of the start of the good run under Gary Williams. And eventually, when you would be done, I believe you decided pretty quickly you wanted to be a coach. How did that kind of process go for you?
Well, this was Gary's last year at AU, was my last year as a player. And I had talked to him about being a grad assistant the following year. Well, Gary took the job at Boston College. And so Eddie Tapscott gets the job at AU. They just moved him up. He much well-deserved. Tap and I had a special relationship for years. We sat on the bus and, we talked a lot of politics, actually. That was one of the things we had in common. And so Tap and I had a real relationship. And he was well aware of the fact that Gary Gary and I had talked about being a grad assistant. So he knew I wanted to coach. We talked a little bit about the second assistant's job, which was open, very low paying. It was one of those things he said, I encourage you to apply for it. You just never know. So I applied for it, talked to him about it. It came down to me and another young assistant coach named John Calipari. And Tap chose poorly. He chose me. And, Tap is one of those guys that's had an indelible imprint on my life. And not just because he chose me, we're just best friends, and so, it was the start of coaching. And we had a great year, first year, because we inherited all the returning guys. We beat Georgetown when they were ranked 5th in the country. We had a good squad. And then everybody left, as they do in college. And you have to rebuild from there. And we did it incrementally over the course of the next 6 or 7 years. And it was, you sort of learn the right way. And it was a slow burn, but it was the right way to build a program.
Chris, I have to get into this, and I got to give credit to Julian Brown, his fabulous Nova podcast, Nova Legends podcast. I got a little bit of filled some blanks in for me, but you were either played for or played under or on staff with Gary Williams, Ed Tapscott, Fran Dunphy. I mean, I can't imagine having a better basketball education, not only including your high school coach, Red Jenkins. I mean, kind of talk about that time at AU under those really legends, not only on court, but of course, Ed Tapscott off the court as well when it came to finding the right players.
Yeah. It's funny. I didn't even mention Dumpf, and Fran is one of the great humans I have ever crossed paths with. Now, after he left AU, he was wildly successful at Penn and Temple, and now he's at LaSalle trying to rebuild that program. I talked to Fran regularly, but those were really special days. We were, so when we were at AU, this was prior to Bender Arena having been built. Mm-hmm. So we played we didn't play. We practiced in a little bandbox gym that was literally just the gym and the walls about 5 feet outside the perimeter of the floor. Our office was, it couldn't have been more than probably 500 or 600 square feet, all three of us in there together. And so there were no secrets, man. And you would sit there and, you'd hear each other on the phone. We all went to recruiting together. And that was back in the day, too, when you could scout. You could actually go see other teams play. Mm-hmm. That's a thing of the past now. But we got to be as good of friends as you could possibly be. And one of the crushing days in my life was when Fran decided to go back to Philadelphia. And I understood it. I mean, he was married and his wife had stayed up there. She had a restaurant. But these are three great guys. And to think that I could be – now, I didn't I didn't coach with Gary, but I coached with Fran and with Tap. And, you talk about, again, right place, right time, common theme, Jeremy. And these guys were just such – not just the coaches. I'm going to put that aside. That's such a nominal part of the equation with the relationship that I have with those guys. Certainly a common thread, but just really people that you want to hang with and be like, the rest of your life.
You talk about right place, right time, Chris, and that's kind of what led to your getting the head job at American, I believe. Tell me about how that came about for you.
Tap and I had been together 8 years, him as head coach, me as an assistant. And he, like a lot of guys, sorry, the dog just came in and made himself available. So like a lot of guys who are extremely well educated and thoughtful, and Tap wanted to do other things. He didn't define himself as a basketball coach, very well read. He decided that he'd had enough. And he left right after we had a great team, really good team, lost a heartbreaking game to Richmond in the Conference CAA tournament finals. And, he just didn't want to go through the rebuild. And so he pulled me aside after the last game and he said, listen, I'm done. And he talked about it, so it wasn't a real surprise. But he said, I've talked to the then athletic director, Joe O'Donnell, about making this as smooth as possible for our young guys, just to have you named head coach within the next couple of days. And so I went in and met with Joe. It was 5 or 10 minute meeting, maybe. And he said, okay, press conference is set for Thursday morning. It happened really, really quickly. I had a chance. I really had an idea of who I wanted on my staff. Or I'd given that some thought. So it all happened really quickly. And, fortunately for me too, there were 3 or 4 really good players coming back that would make that first year, a much easier transition than it would have been otherwise. But, it all sort of fell into place. I was there and accepting, obviously, of the opportunity, and there we go.
What are some of your best memories from that time on Ward Circle? I believe your 7-8 season career as the head coach of a D1 college basketball team.
Well, it was a great conference at the time. The Colonial, as it exists now, is not what it was then, and with no disrespect intended. We had Richmond and VCU. There were great programs, terrific programs. James Madison, which is now no longer a part of that too. So, Lefty was at Madison. Dick Tarrant was at Richmond. Sonny Smith, who I had a chance to visit with just the other day. Sonny Smith was at VCU, and those guys were just monsters. They always had good teams. And Jeff Capel was at Old Dominion. They were outstanding. So those 4 schools alone were just bears to have to deal with. And then here we are, the only private school in the league, AU. I was used to plead at league meetings that if we beat William and Mary, we should get 2 wins. One against William, one against Mary. But it was a tough league. Great guys, great coaches. I used to sit in those league meetings between Lefty and Sonny and Dick, and just kind of shake my head about how did I get here? With these guys, between the 3 of them. They probably won 2,000 games, right? And fortunately, after my first year, I was really lucky. Dick Tarrant asked me to be his assistant coach. We took a CAA All-Star team over to England and played 8 games against various teams around the UK. And that was a great experience. Dick was give you an idea, Jeremy, Dick Tarrant played high school basketball for Vince Lombardi. So that's a pretty good brag right there, right?
Yeah.
And so Dick was that way. He was, he was one way, and he was before our first game, we had such a good team. I mean, we could have beaten a lot of great college teams with the all-star team we had assembled. And I went up before our first game, and I was watching the British national team play. Our practice while our guys were in the locker room. And I'm telling you right now, you and me could go to a restaurant in Fairfax and pick out 3 other guys and have beaten this British national team, using air quotes. So we go down in the locker room, and Dick is doing all, his fire and brimstone, win one for the USA kind of a thing. We're here representing the flag, that sort of thing. So he turned to me and he's like, you got anything you want to say? And I said, yeah, in the War of 1812, the British canoed up the Potomac and burned the White House to the ground. Now, I don't know about you guys, but that still pisses me off. And so the guys started laughing and went flying out the door. Okay, so now it's just me and Dick in the locker room, and I feel this cold front coming in from that general direction. And I said, what's on your mind? Because clearly this is one of those things conversations sometimes can be uncomfortable, but those are the best ones to have, clearing of the air, if you will. And so Dick said, do you think that was appropriate? And I said, I tell you what, I went up and watched the other team practice. I just thought we would be a little bit tight, this being our first game, but I will follow your lead the rest of the trip. I want to be a good soldier. I want to be coachable. I always preach coachability. I can be coachable myself. So it was a great experience playing, coaching with Dick. But the conference it was great. It was unforgiving. Every game was a complete battle, and you learn a lot. I mean, coaches and magicians are the biggest thieves in the world. And I stole plays. I would steal not just from conference, but like we played in a tournament at Tennessee Chattanooga one day and one weekend. And I remember we were playing Tennessee Chattanooga in the championship. And I remember turning to one of my assistant coaches and I knew their play call. I said, when he calls out number 2, I want you to write down exactly what they're doing because I'm stealing that. And so I think that you have to be true to yourself. But you also have to learn from a lot of other people because there are a lot of good coaches that I could tell you about that I thought were great that nobody's ever heard of. A guy like Mike Steele, who was a longtime coach at East Carolina. Nobody knows who Mike Steele is at this point in time. He was a great basketball coach. Just never really had the opportunity, the right place and time. So you have to respect that and know that you don't know it all yourself and other people can help you.
Chris, you were in that league and like you said, unforgiving, and eventually time comes where American and you kind of part ways. When that moment happens, what's your thought process?
I think I was disappointed by the way it was handled, but I understood it and I respected, that sort of thing. I was also ready for something different. Going back to Ed Tapscott and his departure, I always respected the fact that he refused to define himself as just a basketball coach and still doesn't, even though he's a longtime NBA executive. And so I thought that there would be other opportunities for me to stay involved in the game. Turns out there was. I got a chance to get into broadcasting pretty early on. And I got lucky again. I started doing some George Mason games, which led to, that led to an opportunity. I started doing a lot more daytime sports talk radio stuff early on, and a lot of it by myself, which was maybe the best thing that I ever did, Jeremy. I don't think people respect the fact that, listen to a guy like Kevin Sheehan on local radio now, who's in there by himself for 3 or 4 hours. That is a challenge. When you're doing something like that, it is hard not to feel like you're talking to yourself. And so you have to be prepared. You have to be well-versed. You have to be clear thinking. And I think that's one of those things that really helped me in terms of doing games. Obviously, I've been around the sport forever at that point in time. But, the sports talk radio thing, I think, teaches you to be concise and on point. And so all those things sort of happened at the same time. And then I got a huge break late in the basketball season. I was doing sports talk radio. I was actually sitting in. Tony Kornheiser was transitioning from local radio to ESPN nationally. I was doing his show for a 4 or 5 week period in there by myself. And I got a call one day. This was late February. Got a call from Larry Michael, who at that point in time was running CBS radio. And he said, listen, I've been listening to you. I think you do a great job with this stuff. I need somebody to step in and do a game for me this weekend. I got one of my analyst is sick. Are you available on Saturday? And I said, sure. Where do you want me to go? And he said, Carolina at Duke, in Cameron. And so I walked in there, Jeremy, like I had been doing the games for 10 years, just trying to BS people, but it was a big step for me. And it was one of those opportunities, again, right place, right time. Larry gave me the opportunity, and the game was in effect for the ACC championship. It was Vince Carter, Antoine Jameson, Brendan Haywood. Duke was loaded. Duke ended up winning that game in Cameron, overtime game. The game's so good, even I couldn't mess it up. And then I got home that night. I was about 10:30 or 11 o'clock. My phone rings, and it was guys from Host Communications asking me if I was available to do the NCAA tournament 4 days later in that would have been in Lexington, Kentucky, or shortly thereafter. I guess it was. It was right. It was 4 or 5 days later. went down there. But the stat guy that we used was Jim Host, who runs Host Communications. And next thing I know, I get home that Sunday night after 2 great games, and I get a call saying, "Hey, can you come to St. Petersburg? We'd like you to do these games." And I had one of the all-time great games with Kentucky down there. I did the games with Marty Brenneman, who was the longtime voice of the Cincinnati Reds. But, and so Marty and I did 2 games together, including the Elite Eight game, and fabulous opportunity. And the next year I did a bunch of games for CBS. I worked with the great Joel Myers. I did the NCAA tournament again with Joel. And, again, you just can't script it. I keep telling my girlfriend I'm the luckiest guy on the planet. You just need to stay close to me because things just seem to break right for me. And those were a couple of years where they broke right. It seemed like time after time.
I tell you what, one thing I've always loved about your analyst style is the fact that, as a guy who's done a lot of play-by-play in my life, no one ever has to drag things out of you. You're ready to go with a comment, but I feel like that has to go back to, 1, your nature, but 2, all the time you did solo broadcasting by yourself. You're used to talking. You're used to coming up with points, not necessarily having to wait and knowing when to jump in. Do you feel like that helped you getting that opportunity to do radio where it was kind of a nice transition once you got in? You already had the coaching knowledge. You also kind of had the broadcasting knowledge.
Yeah, it teaches you a certain economy, and also it teaches you to recognize situations. Like for instance, if you're doing sports talk radio and you have a guest, a guy you've asked to call in, and you have him for the 10, 12, 13-minute segment. I love to listen to them. That's how you learn, right? It's not about you and your questions. Sometimes the best question that you could ever ask anybody, whether it's on the radio or whatever, is just why. Explain that last answer to me. Why is that so? And that way you get, full expansion of thought, right? So radio to me taught me how to, you're basically the accordion, where if it's your segment alone for 12 or 13 minutes, you expand out. If it's you with a guest or with somebody else in the studio, you expand in. And it's one of those things that you sort of learn by osmosis, I think, Jeremy. It's not one of those things that I think was ever articulated to me. It's just one of those things that's, you learn innately. And, but yeah, I love the sports talk radio experience. I don't do a lot of it anymore. I was doing a lot of it up until this past fall, I think. And then I just, I've got enough on my plate right now.
Yeah.
But it was an invaluable experience for me, for sure.
You're wearing your Maryland gear right now. For those of you watching this, obviously the listeners can't see it, but that's what you've kind of been defined by over the last really 25 years as being the analyst at Maryland Basketball. How did that come about?
So I had been doing games for, Westwood One, and I was also, I had my pick of games. I was doing a lot of, strangely enough, talk about life going full circle. I was doing the Big Ten game of the week. Now I'm in the Big Ten all the time, right? So I was doing a lot of games. And then in the fall, this would have been my 3rd year out of coaching. I got a call. Gary Williams called me. And he said, "Listen, I don't know if you'd be interested in this, but Greg Manning, who had been doing Maryland's analyst work for, I think, 12 or 13 years, was leaving to take an athletic director's job down in Georgia. He's leaving. And if you'd be interested in it, I would arrange for a meeting between you and our athletic director, Debbie Yao." And so I set up the meeting, and I, went and talked to Gary first. And Gary said, "Listen, as far as I'm concerned, you got the job, but you have to go see her." And so I went up and talked to her for a little bit, and then she did the thing where she grabbed an index card, wrote a number on it, and handed it to me. And she said, "Would this be enough to get you to say yes?" And I grew up a Maryland fan, Jeremy. I grew up when there were 4 channels on TV, yep, and Maryland basketball was on every single game. And I can't say I was consumed by it, but I was a fan. I grew up, loving the program. So I did ask her to give me 24 hours and just to sort of did want to noodle it because I had a good thing going and I was doing games, but it was so much travel involved with Westwood One, and my kids were young. But one of the guys I asked about this, a good friend of mine, Doc Walker, who of course is the king of local talk radio. And I was explaining the opportunity to him shortly after the offer came. And I said, what do you think? And he said, you know what? I'm going to tell you this. He said, at the time he was doing a lot of ACC games, football games. And so he said, it's great what you're doing right now, but you're a bit of a mercenary. You go where they point you, where they send you, and then they pay you. He said, when you're with a team, it's a completely different thing. You root, you have relationships. It's one of those things that's a part of your blood. And he said, if I were you, I would jump on this. And I bought in, because of course I'd been a part of a team.
Yep.
I know what that's like, and as much as I love the Westwood One gigs, I called Miss Yao the next day. I called Debbie and just said, listen, I'm in, tell me what I need to do, where I need to go, what I need to sign, and let's get it going.
Chris, you've gotten to work with a true legend in broadcasting in Johnny Holiday, and your perspective on him obviously is a little different than mine. I was born in 1979, so I only know him as the sports broadcaster. Well, I'm assuming you got some of the Johnny Holiday radio hosts growing up, and then you come to work with him. What's it been like, and what's the relationship like between you and Johnny?
Well, it's great now. It was a little rocky the first couple of years because I'm a different guy than Greg Manning was, and just you have a different outlook. And Greg's a great guy, tremendous guy, and I think it took Johnny a little while to get used to that. And I got him in trouble a couple of times with some of the things I said, particularly, and part of it was shtick, where I would talk about officials and that stealing money off my table and things like that, but he's a Hall of Famer in so many different ways and a legend. It's amazing that he's still doing the games at the level that he's doing them. And I'm just, completely blessed. I did grow up, to your point, Jeremy, I did grow up listening to him on radio. And I remember telling him, I remember delivering papers when I was 10, 12 years old. And on rainy days, my dad would drive me put me in the car. And it was always Johnny Holiday on the radio, drive time morning radio. And so I'm respectful of everything he's done. He tells great stories, introducing the Beatles and the Monkees and, being a big part of that 1960s California scene. He was in San Francisco. And it's tremendous. The stories alone are worth the price of admission.
I tell you what, early on, I got a chance in my radio career to interview Johnny, ostensibly about Maryland basketball. But at one point, I was at a small station, Wage Radio, Leesburg, Virginia, and I told him that we had a show on Saturday mornings where they played vinyl. And I tell you what, he could not have been more happy. And he's like, hey, could I come guest on your show? And I was like, well, yes, of course you could. But
that's great.
It was always great because you know how much he loved that. You talk about with Johnny, and really early on, you kind of scale the heights as Maryland has that really good run early in your time there. What was that like?
Surreal. And it's also, Maryland won the national championship in the third year of me doing games. Got to the Final Four of my second and third year. Sweet 16 the year after that, you start to think those things are a birthright and that they happen all the time, and they don't. Certain programs, certainly have achieved a certain level, Michigan State, Gonzaga, what have you, where they're in that conversation every year. But man, it is hard work getting there. And I'm so respectful of the job that Gary Williams did, with the collection of guys that he got. He had one McDonald's All-American, and he's a guy who transferred out, Danny Miller. And he cobbled together this group with the right size and the right chip on their shoulder. And it was to have won a championship, was just unbelievable. And I remember this, Jeremy, the championship is won in Atlanta, right?
Yep.
2002. And so there was a long parade of Maryland fans, of course, traveling back from Atlanta up I-85 back to the DMV, right? Well, you know what's on I-85, short, just off of I-85, is Cameron Indoor Coliseum. So I remember the Duke ticket manager. It's a great story. The Maryland ticket manager was a woman named Wendy Brown, and she told me that the Duke ticket manager called her and said, "Make it stop." And Wendy's like, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "There are hundreds of Maryland fans that have pulled into Cameron today with their Maryland National Championship T-shirts, taking their picture in front of Cameron Indoor Stadium," and which I think speaks to the rivalry that was at that time, But yeah, it was a great moment. I got to watch in the ring and all that stuff, and special times.
What's your approach, philosophy to doing analysis, Chris?
I don't really have one. I let the game sort of play itself out. Try to be prepared, not over prepared. Analyst work is completely different from play-by-play work. Play-by-play work requires a level of preparation. The analysis really requires, I think, a knowledge of the game and what each side is trying to accomplish. So I don't really go into any game with any preconceived notion. Again, I'd like to see it play out. And I think still, I try to think that I'm nimble enough to sort of, again, let it play out and respond accordingly. So I don't really go in with any real thought process in terms of, other than that.
You mentioned play-by-play. You've done some of that over the years, filling in for Johnny. How tough was that for you at the beginning of it? And what do you like doing it?
I like doing it because it's different. I also like doing it because some of the times where I've done it, it allows Walt Williams, who's our third guy, and he does Maryland home games with us. It allows Walt a seat at the adult table, and so I do like doing it, and it is something different. One of the things that I'm respectful of is that when I do slide over and take Johnny's spot, the bar's set pretty high. I'm not Johnny. I don't, I'm not. I'll do the best job I can do in that circumstance. And again, it requires a level of preparation, but and it's hard not to lapse into analysis while you're doing the game. I like to sort of concentrate on a couple different principles, not the least of which, and it sounds really stupid, Jeremy, but you've been doing this forever too. Time and score is very important. You got to make sure radio is different from TV. TV, the pictures sort of play, let it play out. It speaks volumes to folks. Radio, you have to assume people are in their cars hanging on every word, and they need to know time, score, location, things like that. Absolutely critical.
Chris, a couple more with you before we wrap you up. And of course, you've been so generous with your time. You've been able to maybe combine two of your passions with the DC Coaches podcast, where you're not only doing radio, but doing it with guys who really help shape you, Gary Williams, Ed Tapscott. Tell me about that program and why it's kind of a labor of love for you.
Yeah, it was a lark, Jeremy's complete lark with these guys, and a friend of mine who runs a podcast company in Boston had put it together. It was those four, Gordon, Tap, Gary, and myself, that started out doing it. We since have added Jimmy Patsos to the equation. And so it's a blast. I can't say we're getting paid in a big way, but I wouldn't miss it. It's one of those things we record. We used to record it live. When Gary had a restaurant, we still get out periodically. That was the picture there is at Lito's, who's a really great sponsor of ours. We did an end of season show there last year. We still get out periodically, but for the most part, we do it via Zoom. And these are great friends. I recognize that Gary's the straw that stirs that drink. And it wouldn't be the same without him. I appreciate the fact that he continues to show up every week, but it's a boatload of fun. It's some of the conversations are hysterical and some are a little obtuse, but it's a lot. It's all hoops all the time for sure.
You can find out more about that on social media. Also, is it DC Coaches Basketball Podcast?
Yes, DC Coaches Basketball Podcast.
Make sure we get the official name out
there.
There
you go.
Last one for you, Chris, and I know this one's going to be close to your heart. Your daughter has kind of gotten into the family business where she has worked in operations and on bench for some of these, I believe Utah State, VCU, obviously spent some time as Maryland. That's where she got her degree from. What did you think when she told you that's what she wanted to do?
I wasn't surprised because she grew up going to games with me. There we are at Utah State. Now she's at VCU, but she's the director of operations for Coach Ryan Odom, and she does a really, really good job with it. That was a couple of years ago, as I said, when she was out in Logan, Utah. She's out of witness protection now and back in Richmond. But Jeremy, she had been going to games with me. She had been a ball kid at Maryland games at age 5 or 6 years old. And so it was in her blood. She played in high school. I think she really loves the college game. And I'm proud of her. One thing I keep telling her, though, is do not limit yourself. She loves doing what she's doing right now, but she's very, very capable. And I think she'd be a great athletic administrator because she has seen the coach's side of things. She'd be a great athletic director or senior women's administrator. And I've encouraged her to really look at opportunities in that path because there are plenty of them out there.
Well, I know she'll do well because she's got a great mentor in you that, again, you've lived such a great basketball life. I was kind of thinking about it. And you're a guy that has kind of been in the DC basketball consciousness for going on 50 years now. I know. I don't want to age you, Chris, but I think it's true. Your days at Woodson on the All-Met team all the way till now as a big voice for Maryland.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Joe. I'm a little bit like I'm Forrest Gump. I just happen to be at the tipping point at these fulcrum level events, and I've been just lucky as hell. And I appreciate you having me on today.
And we appreciate you. Chris Knoche, analyst for Maryland basketball, former American University basketball coach. Thank you so much for joining Huber and Friends.
Thanks.